This meeting is being recorded.
It's not a very pretty voice. Hi, my name's Chuck Fall. Oops, my screen is freezing up, isn't it?
No, I'm seeing you.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and do something here, something with the spotlight. Okay, so I'm Chuck Fall. This is a Green Liberty Caucus third Friday national meeting, and we are having a conversation about climate change, global warming, climate change denialism, and this matter of revising what is climate change and global warming grew out of a Green Renaissance meeting. So you are at a Green Liberty Caucus national meeting. I have participated with John Olsen in developing the Green Renaissance sovereign rights movement. That group had a conversation over several months about global warming because I pushed back against, I was hearing things that made me wonder about the narrative that the people, my comrades were subscribing to. And is carbon dioxide good or bad? Basic fundamental questions like that. And the notion that more is better, more CO2 is better because plants like it. So we had a essay was produced. Green Liberty has been agnostic on climate change debate. I, like the trans issue, feel there are more important issues to be working on and grappling with, and in particular, it's the problem of plutocracy, generically, sociologically, politically, economically. That's our fundamental problem. However, there's been interest for a kind of reckoning with what's true around global warming and climate change. So that's what we're exploring this evening. And I'll let John Olsen make an introduction of himself. He's going to go next. He was participated with me at Green Renaissance. We developed an essay at Covert Action. And so that's, we can refer to that, and that can be put into the meeting notes. John Olsen, I'm going to turn.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. Okay, I have been a political activist since 1966 and an environmentalist from shortly after that, as I began to be conscious of certain realities. So I'm not in the denial category at all. So I hope people aren't coming expecting that. So I've written a single page here that I want to read out, one page, putting together as coherently as I can what my position is. So I will go forward from this. I also was a member of SDS, Draft Resistance, founder of both, and founding member of Peace and Freedom Party in Hawaii, and later, 20 years later, the Hawaii Green Party in 1989. And I've been a Green ever since, although with a lot more skepticism and perhaps cynicism in recent years. So I do believe there has been in our lifetime significant climate change, and that human activity has played a significant but not exclusive role in it. The Earth has experienced far greater non-human climate changes over eons. Maine, some 12 to 15,000 years ago, had a mile of ice, and that's not the enforcement agents, by the way, but the real ice covering it. Chief factors in human-caused weather and hence, over time, climate change are massive deforestation and deliberate fires to clear land, huge landscapes with monocropping, especially corn and soybeans, decimated animal species who help balance natural relations, e.g., killing off huge herds of buffalo, leading directly to the 1930s Dust Bowl and loss of fertile soil and negative siltation of rivers and ocean deltas. 4, huge dams that interrupt to some extent the natural hydro cycle. Number 5, industrial pollution, including unburned or partially burned carbon, along with mercury and other heavy metal toxic residues that have affected plant and animal as well as human health, e.g., the massive decline in insect and bird population in recent decades. 6, but above all, nefarious geoengineering that toxifies the air, soil, and water on which all life depends. Will Thomas and Dane Wigington have done superb research into this phenomenon, with numerous scientific measurements showing concentrations of aluminum, strontium, and barium concentrations, that's repeated, off the charts in some areas. Meanwhile, the molecule CO2 has played the role of Mr. Oswald, the patsy, in receiving all the blame, something I accepted for too long as well, being duped by all the accusations. What turned me around was doing the mathematics of it. We are told that if we can get back to 350 parts per million from the current 425 parts per million actually in the atmosphere, all will be well and we can relax. But the actual math of the situation shows that the difference between those figures is a minuscule 0.0075%, less than 1/100th of a percent difference. It strains credibility that this amount is at all significant. Colleagues, we have an ecological crisis, not a CO2 crisis. And for those who persist in pushing that lie, are like the medical professionals assuring us that mRNA vaccines are safe and effective, regardless of massive and unrelenting evidence to the contrary. Now, some will say this is providing a cover for the petroleum giants, a shallow and not very honest response. Yes, we ought to be scaling back dependence on burning petroleum products for electricity and, when viable, transportation. Save it for superb use as lubricants and plastics, but find ways to recycle or render harmless the myriad quantity of plastic products. None of us with a history of ecological activism are big fans of petroleum industry, but we recognize that for some uses, e.g., farm and heavy equipment, there's nothing now really better. Likewise for making steel, not viable with solar panels or windmills. Accusations that folks taking this perspective are apologists for oil giants, or worse, even agents for such, are not only dishonest but far-fetched. Increasingly, real scientists are coming to these conclusions just cited. But the melting of the Siberian tundra and Arctic ice releasing methane is another matter, which likewise deserves a scientific and not a hysterical, accusatory approach. I rest my case.
John, thank you for your presentation. Does anybody want to ask John any immediate clarifying question? Or we can take notes and proceed with our next speaker.
Okay, I've got a rebuttal to all that.
Okay, well,
Please.
and then let's hopefully we can loop around and actually have some conversation.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, you know, right now with everything that's going on in the world, with, you know, the Gaza genocide and war in Ukraine and Trump, you know, going nuts in all kinds of ways, ICE detention centers and, you know, gutting federal regulations, which is certainly has something to do with this topic of climate change. You know, the issue of climate change has kind of been put on the back burner, but 2024 was the hottest year on record, and 2025 is scheduled to be a lot hotter. And I've seen that here in the Northwest, where it's much drier and hotter than it's been. If you look at the fire map, there's fires virtually everywhere. So as far as carbon, we can start with carbon because it's an important thing. It's not a minuscule increase at all, because if you look at the atmosphere, more than 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen.
Right.
More than 21% is oxygen. 0.9%, that's 0.9, that's not quite 1%, is argon. So carbon makes up 0.42 to, it's up to, I would say 0.43, because it's 340 parts per million. So if you basically, what is 340 parts per million? That's basically 4/100ths of 1%, basically, is what it is. And so if you go back to 1750, that's before the Industrial Revolution, it was at 275 parts per million. By 1950, it was up to just above 300 parts per million. So, and now it's up to, it was recorded this winter, I believe, in Hawaii at this NOAA station on top of,
Mauna Loa.
yes, exactly. At 430, surpassing 430 parts per million. And it's kind of gone down a little bit from that. So it's not consistently at that level, but it's still above, 425 parts per million. So that's actually a 56% increase in carbon. And if you look at the greenhouse gases, let me just, there's several greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And carbon makes up the largest percentage of them. And then there's also methane, nitrous oxide, methane making up about 11.1%, nitrous oxide is 6.1%. And then these other fluorocarbons or fluorinated gases, and there's several of them that are problematic. And these are kind of industrial, pollutants that if there's enough of them, they're actually worse than carbon. It's true,
Right.
But they're usually in much smaller doses. And some of these are actually ozone depleting. So they're actually very significant, in terms of what they can do to the environment. I mean, they only make up 3.1% of the greenhouse gases. So carbon is actually there longer than any, it stays longer than methane or any of these other gases in the atmosphere. And it's also responsible for if you look at biodiversity, and what they're claiming is that you're going to see, because of the rise in temperatures, you're going to see a massive die-off by 2050. But and then by the end of the century, 70% of all living things, plant and animal species, could be extinct on the planet. And it's really the oceans that are absorbing 90% of the heat over the past 50 years. And all the carbon that's being absorbed is changing the pH in the water. So you're having things like coral bleaching, they're not producing their shells. Sea life is not producing the shells the normal way it would. So you have dead zones in the ocean from too much, like, I guess warmer water has less oxygen in it. So there's dead zones in the ocean. So the oceans are majorly impacted. And then you look at the ocean economy, it's a $2.2 trillion economy per year that employs something like as many as, I think it's 3 billion people. So you're looking at something that if we don't do something about it, we can say, well, it's not carbon and it's these other greenhouse gases. But ultimately it is probably carbon more than anything else, but in any case, yeah, methane is a problem. And people say, oh, cow farts, that's probably not it. Even though factory farming, does produce nitrous oxide, it's just not the same as having cattle in a big pasture where they're actually good for the soil. They say, where it's, they help regenerate the soil. But when you've got cattle or pigs or whatever in a pen, and they're walking around their manure and their urine, that's producing some pretty nasty, soup of like that kicks off nitrous oxide and methane, and it's so that's certainly a factor as well. And then fracking, there's a lot of methane coming off of fracking sites and off of off oil wells. In fact, I read some stuff years ago, because fracking is big in Colorado on the Front Range, that most wells leak about 1 to 2%. So there's a constant leak from wells. And then of course you had the massive blowout of the storage facility for natural gas in Porter Ranch, California, back in 2015, that dumped more methane into the atmosphere than all the cars in LA, all the greenhouse gases that would be produced from all the cars in LA for a period of a year. And then of course the Biden blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, that's one of the largest release of methane in history. So ultimately, what gets left out of the whole equation, and there's been these COP summits going on since 1995, and COP 26 in 2021 in Glasgow, Scotland, Abby Martin, independent journalist with the Empire Files, confronted Nancy Pelosi on the fact that she voted for a record increase for the military budget, and yet there's no regulations, greenhouse gas regulations or pollution regulations for the military. And she called her out on this because ultimately the military is producing, it's producing a lot of more pollution than probably anything on Earth, and it's using more fossil fuels than anybody. It's the number one user of fossil fuels on the planet. And then of course all these wars, you look at what's happening in Gaza, and you just got to think, God, all those bombs being exploded, that's got to have some major impact as well on greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're not doing as a world community what we should be doing, which is cooperating with governments around the world. When we have these COP summits where everybody flies in on their private jets and burns a bunch of fossil fuels, and rather than have a Zoom meeting and basically accomplish nothing. I mean, they're supposed to update their climate plans every 5 years, and the largest polluters haven't. They're going to this summit now, and it's in November in Brazil, without really any real plan on how to combat the situation. So and then as far as the way Trump is using this stuff, he picked 5 climate denial scientists to basically say that carbon emissions are not responsible for greenhouse gases. And there was a massive pushback on this by independent scientists, and I guess the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, the Department of Energy, was forced to disband this group of scientists. There's now a lawsuit by the Environmental Defense Fund and the Union for Concerned Scientists against the Trump administration. They're alleging that the Trump administration quietly arranged for 5 handpicked skeptics of effects of climate change to compile the government's climate report, and violated the law by creating the report in secret with the authors of only one viewpoint. Adam Dressler, professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M University, coordinated with the response from climate experts. He says, unlike the DOE report, climate reports from groups such as the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change featured the work of hundreds of scientists and requires multiple rounds of peer review. When well-established scientific conclusions are challenged by arguments that ignore or contradict decades of solid evidence, these debates don't advance our understanding. Dressler noted that instead they muddy the waters and distract from a more productive scientific inquiry. And so to go forward with this, Trump is basically gutting environmental regulations. And one of the things he's doing, and today is the last day for public comment, is he's gutting the roadless rule. And I take this actually really personally, because I have been in areas that are roadless, the Wind Rivers being one of them, and this is to increase logging in various wilderness areas and put roads in there, which will actually increase the possibility of fires once you have people able to drive into these areas and throw their cigarette butt out on the ground. And, these are pristine areas where the water is protected from you know, pollution that you're going to get from clear cutting or from, you know, if they do oil exploration in these wilderness areas. And so that's only going to accelerate the climate crisis. It's absolutely an abomination that they're thinking of going into these areas and whether you believe in climate change or not, that they're going to take these very pristine areas. I've been into the winds in 2 different entrances, hiked 20 miles from the road and spent 16 days in there on one trip to climb the north face of Mount Hooker. And it's, you know, it's an amazing area, and it shouldn't, the areas like that shouldn't be compromised, but it will increase, you know, the climate crisis. But Wyoming, what they're saying in Wyoming is that timber revenue brings in less than $100 million a year. But national parks in Wyoming bring in $1 billion, and the outdoor industry in Wyoming, and this includes everything from rock climbing to fishing to hunting, you know, to hiking and mountain biking, it brings in $2.2 billion annually.
Mark, can I interject?
Sure.
You have a little bit more information to share with us?
I do have a little bit more. I mean, I'll wrap it up pretty soon here, but
Okay.
it's,
Then
you know,
go ahead and wrap it up, and then we're going to go to John Olsen, and
No,
he
no.
wanted to make,
Okay.
and then I
Okay, well, I just wanted to
Mark,
comment
and then
on
go
the
to
scientists on the CO2 coalition who, you know, one of the points that's been made is some of these scientists are Nobel laureate scientists. Well, if you look at the CO2 coalition, which claims that carbon is good and, you know, plants need carbon, well, plants only have, you know, aspire, or they can't survive if the carbon is below 150 parts per million. So anyway, the scientists that work for this organization is been funded by the Koch brothers, the Mercer family, the what is it, the Sarah Skype family, and ExxonMobil has even been a contributor in the past to them, and it's run by an oil executive. So for me to be saying that these scientists are somehow creditable, you know, when they're working for an organization that's funded by the oil industry and big polluters, just doesn't add up. And you can say, well, government scientists are working for, you know, the renewable energy industry, but then you have the problem with that is you have the oil companies back in the 1970s, Shell and Exxon, coming up with this information, and they weren't doing it to share their information with the public. They were doing their information just to know the facts. And the documents that have been leaked from those oil companies prove that they were coming up with accurate climate models and predicting all this back in the 1970s, that carbon and continuing to burn fossil fuels would cause global warming. So I don't buy the argument that you can rely on these climate denial scientists as a legitimate source of information. And I think there's been too much information that's been put out by too many scientists to deny it. And if we are, as human beings, having a impact, and the last thing I'll say is people say, well, the sun causes it. Well, NASA says that that's true when you look at past events, but the amount of global warming that's happening, the sun is actually weaker than it was in the past, they say. And so the amount of warming we're seeing now can only be, the only conclusion is that it's from human-caused climate change. So, all right, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. Let's go straight to John Olsen, and then John
Okay.
Spritzler has been posting in the chat, and if you came late to the meeting, we might have to repost because you only see in the chat.
Yeah. If those two who just joined, Dan and Maureen, can post your email in the chat, I will write it down and send you what I did. I began with a several paragraph introduction affirming that I am definitely an ecologist, have been for decades, and that much of what Mark is saying is I'm in full agreement with. In fact, I'll mention a couple of these things. Certainly, Trump and the Koch brothers and all these folks are hostile to environmental concerns because they think only about economic profit margins and so forth. And bringing up clear cutting, that's one I hadn't mentioned. That's an important factor as well. Clearly, the military use. I did read your article, by the way, Mark, before we got into this meeting, the one you just posted. Military use is abominable. One good example of taking a World Heritage pristine site is the island of Jeju off the coast of South Korea, where it was a remarkably beautiful place. And they came in against years and years of protests by the locals who had been massacred way back in the World War II and afterward by the neo-fascists that were coming into power after having defeated the Japanese fascists. So they bombed at this area or exploded and have built this horrible military installation on Jeju, which certainly Emanuel knows about. There's a wonderful film that I don't know, Emanuel, if you've seen this, The Ghost of Jeju by Rita Tremblay. You know that. I see you're nodding. Okay. Okay. So, and fracking, you did mention fracking, another thing. So it goes back to, again, we have an ecological crisis, and so much of what Mark said validates that point. I don't agree with the idea that that carbon has increased 56%. It's 0.0075% actual quantity increase in the atmosphere. If you look at the math, between 350 parts per million and 425 parts per million, that is the figure. You do the math on it. It's not 56. If you just compare
I'm
those
going
numbers,
from 1750 from the before the
yeah,
Industrial
okay.
Revolution.
Even so, okay, that would be a little bit more because we're going from 350, but you're looking only at those percentages, and you're not looking at the volume of CO2 in the atmosphere. So I would have to go back and you said it was like 275. Okay,
Right.
that might end up 0.009% instead of 75.
Right.
At any
Yeah,
rate.
008 basically 0028 versus from to 430 to
Okay.
to 043.
So in other words, the volume of CO2 in the air is a minuscule amount. It's increased, yes. I do agree, as we have talked, that the human causation is an important factor. To me, the most important one is the geoengineering. These deliberate fires that are being set, the steering of hurricanes to create deluge in one place and huge fires in another. That's not by accident. I think we all know that. And so acidification is a good point. The dead zone, that's also partly from the chemical runoff. It's not just from the CO2, it's chemical runoff from this industrial agriculture. So I guess those cover most of the points that I wanted to make in response to Mark.
Okay, well, then you're going to get to respond to Emanuel. I have some remarks. I have some perspectives that are building up for me. But Emanuel, why don't we go straight to you? And but let me just add this. Let me just give you quickly what I'm taking away here is that there's a parallel discussion. I mean, we're all grappling with what is climate change, what is global warming, what is human contribution to this phenomena that occurs on multiple levels and expresses in multiple different ways, and what's naturally imposed on us. And in that, the science is muddled on all of this, and or to the extent that the science has been made muddled, it's become muddled. And
Right.
And I just showed by a picture of Ben Franta, a guy who wrote an article, and I'll show it again. It's on the TAP website, and it's to the point of that Mark has raised. In other words, corporations were aware of problematic with unbridled burning of fossil fuels. They also were aware of the problematic around plastic production, And now we're
Mhm.
just ubiquitous. Plastic, they've known. And they've covered this up just like they've always known about tobacco unhealth, the unhealth, and they covered up. So we're actually kind of wading into a covering up. And then, and then at the same time, we're grappling with, well, what's true about the friggin' science of Earth's ecology? Is Earth a closed system that has these dynamic forces that play out, or is it an open system of infinite possibilities and so on? That's where we're at right now. We're in a kind of fog of war, I would suggest. And I'll just um, I'll close with this: that Green Liberty Caucus endeavors to work within the Green Party and work outside the Green Party to advance the Liberation Coalition, to call out state crimes, especially because that's my and I'm deeply indignant about state crimes. And so what we're trying to do this evening is clarify what is this question of climate change, global warming really all about. And I think where there's absolute consensus is that there has been a huge impact from human civilization itself on nature, without a doubt. Okay. And so now the question is, who's responsible? Should a polluter pay? Should we have carbon tax? Should the monies from the carbon tax be used to mitigate? And we've had some distinctions between mitigate and regenerate and things like that. So let's go straight to Emanuel, and then we're going to loop back around in some Q&A. John Spritzler, I invite you to psych up for some remarks. You've been posting in chat, and you have perspective on this, and we welcome your input. Emanuel, I'm going to put you in the spotlight. Okay, take care. Good luck. Go for it.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad we're able to have this discussion at last after a year and a half. And I want to state first that in governance, in policy, democracy is important, having participation and reflecting the views of people. But science is also important, and science is never democratic. It's based upon the assertion of scientific fact, and it's not voted on, and that we have to adhere to a scientific process and the scientific method in policy. It's totally unacceptable to say this many people believe this or this number of people believe this, or to even say this is my opinion. This is not an issue of opinion. It's an issue of scientific fact. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened in the COVID-19 reign of terror and how it's related to climate change debate. I was there. I was in Washington, D.C. In January 2019, and I watched how this process, the discussion was altered. And I saw that there was a devious effort to create an environment in which truth tellers, those that spoke out against COVID-19, spoke the truth about 9/11, were obligated to say that climate change was a fraud in return for publicity, for exposure, and I think for payments. And although it's poorly defined so far, because unlike the COVID-19 operation or 9/11, in which so many people have exposed the conspiracies, this one has not been addressed yet. Although we can trace it back to the efforts of the Koch brothers and others and the CO2 coalition. But the big money and the propaganda push really started in 2019. Behind this, I would trace it back to the series of talks by Admiral Samuel Locklear in 2013 in Boston and DC. He was then commander of Pacific Command, and he formally made a statement as the sort of the intellectual of the military that global warming, climate change was the primary threat, and that the entire approach to security in the United States and to the economy had to be changed. And others in the military, like Larry Wilkerson, retired General Stephen Chaney and others who established a new American security project moved towards this. And there was a fundamental restructuring of the approach or the idea of security and climate change in Washington, D.C. And this started to really go mainstream in 2018. This was accompanied by the rise of Extinction Rebellion, which became quite effective in 2019 in organizing citizens, bringing climate change, which was to the forefront, especially under the leadership of Roger Hallen, who I interviewed in April 2019, and I was active in their group. I watched how Extinction Rebellion was infiltrated and destroyed in late 2019 by outside forces when they grew too powerful. And then they were run by a bunch of patsies and corporate go-tos, and suddenly the conspiracy theorists were saying, oh, they're just the puppets of the globalists, a globalist trap. And this was not what happened. It was also paralleled with the success of the Yellow Jackets, who had come close to toppling the French government. And that also is one of the big things that led, I believe, to the COVID-19 actions. And COVID-19 itself, this whole fraud, was the death of science in America. That was its whole point. And popular figures suddenly were saying just about anything because science was profoundly undermined by having all these so-called authorities saying that COVID-19 was this pandemic and everyone had to have these vaccines, et cetera. One of the parts of that was we started getting these popular figures promoted who were saying climate change is good or CO2 is good, it's harmless, et cetera. And it went from being a fly-by-night think tanks funded by the Koch brothers to actually being front and center. This climate change is a myth. Human-caused climate change is a myth. Now, I experienced this myself personally in our demonstrations in Korea against the COVID-19 lockdowns, in which my friend Shin Jae-ho basically confessed to me that he was supposed to throw in this climate change is a hoax materials into his demonstrations in order to get funding. And I said to him, you can talk about climate change as a hoax, but first I want a debate between the two of us about this issue because I know something about this. And he refused. He refused. He had to push this stuff. And after the COVID-19 attack on science, we start to get these figures who become mainstream and seem somewhat respectable. The first is James Corbett, the Corbett Report, who gives a mixed mash of 60% true, 40% fraud on his very sophisticated, highly polished and well-funded Corbett Report. Now, I have interacted with him by email. He refused to talk to me directly and refused to debate me, but he's a classic, and he's quoted by all the others pushing this argument that somehow climate change is a globalist fraud. Another group is Matt Ehret and Cynthia Chung of Rising Tide Foundation, who I have actually spoken with on the phone, although they refuse to do anything with me. And they put forth a very sophisticated but profoundly wrong argument about how growth is good, we should just keep growing, the population is fine, that we can have another couple billion people, and climate change caused by human action, by carbon, is a fraud. And I saw this over and over again, this push to try and get people to believe that climate change is a fraud in any discussion of 9/11 and COVID-19 truth. And I was often the only one in the room who was willing to say, 9/11 was clearly set up. COVID-19 is clearly not what people say. It's a fraud. The Federal Reserve is counterfeiting money, and climate change is plenty real and caused by carbon emissions and by human action. And it was almost nobody was allowed to do that, although it's not zero. And so these reports, they create piles of data. These are the climate change is a myth reports. Piles of data from uncertain sources and they ignore fundamental scientific research that would have to be refuted to make a scientific case. That is to say, if they wanted to prove that it's made up, that this is not true, the first thing they'd have to do is take on the scientific research which exists in the public domain and show how it's inaccurate. And they refuse to do that. They make up their own garbage, and they refuse to take on the accepted, repeatedly tested research which has already been done. This is a red flag that you're dealing with an operation, not with science. They use impressionistic and misleading concepts. Carbon is harmless. Carbon's just a small part of the atmosphere, to cover up basic scientific facts and research. It is anyone who's taken physics or chemistry in high school and college, which I have, knows that a small amount like 0.5, 0.1 or lower can be a critical factor which causes a transformation. The small amount is totally irrelevant. It has to do with chemistry and physics. And it has been shown, as we know, from the Permian extinction 250 million years ago, I think, which wiped out 98 to 99% of the animals on the Earth, that what happened was carbon increased a small amount. This set up a chain reaction which warmed the oceans. Warming the oceans released methane, which was in liquid solid form at the bottom of the oceans, which then went into the atmosphere, and that triggered a massive warming and transformation of the climate, which killed off everything. And I mean, not everything, but most everything. And that's how it works. So carbon sets off a reaction which causes methane to be released. This is taking place right now. Then we had what I thought was maybe the most devious, was that the World Economic Forum, especially after 2018, starts to use climate change to promote its own totalitarian vision, smart cities, digital currencies, and the use of electricity. And this was used by the other side as proof that climate change is a myth. And then they quote, Greta Thunberg or Al Gore and say these people are, full of crap, right? These people are not scientists. They get stuff wrong. They're irrelevant for the discussion about what climate change is, because it's an issue of science, not how much you appear on YouTube. And maybe even more disturbing to me was a discussion about the famed book called The Limits of Growth that was published by the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome is related to a large number of wealthy individuals at the time. It's not a perfect organization, but the book that it put out, The Limits of Growth, was accurate. And it described how this growth, consumption-based growth system was going to be destructive for human society. And so this relatively accurate study has been attacked constantly in this anti-globalization, climate change is a myth group as being somehow the globalist conspiracy. But that was not what it was. And it has led to a false discussion about the issue of climate change. And I want to just at the end talk about geoengineering and forest fires. Now, geoengineering is being used in many classified programs today, and it is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Primarily, it's being used to counter climate change by releasing particles which are supposed to block or reflect the sun and its radiation. That's the primary use of geoengineering. It is also used to drop various dangerous chemicals as part of other projects and other experiments, including nanotechnology. I don't know, and most people don't know exactly what they're doing because it's all classified. And this is going on, but it's not making a tremendous, enormous change in our climate. There are technologies used to create or enhance storms and earthquakes. These exist, but they are not all that effective, and they do not explain the tremendous warming of the Earth today. Storms may be increased or enhanced by such geoengineering, but they're not created by it, and that is a myth. But it's not without basis in some technology and some classified programs in the government. So I'm not denying the existence of geoengineering. Regarding forest fires, for the most part, are a result of global warming and also scarcity of water and the rampant development programs which are destroying the natural environment, the privatization of water, etc. Arguments are made that forest fires are set on purpose using satellites with directed energy weapons. It's clear that there are some forest fires that have been set on purpose, most likely precisely for the purpose of promoting such theories that climate change is a myth and forest fires are caused by satellites. It's highly unlikely that satellites in their current form are capable of using directed energy weapons to actually start forest fires on the ground. And there is research on this topic. But some of the pictures in this conspiracy websites about how the forest fires burned, etc., certainly suggest that something other than a normal forest fire took place in those particular cases. This I totally agree with, but it's entirely possible that those whole things were rigged up, that people burned these things, houses, whatever, to make it look like it was done by satellites, when in fact it was not. It was set up to create this mythology that somehow the global elites using satellites are setting all these forest fires. So the conclusion I would say is we don't really know all of these things, but that the climate change is a conspiracy gravy train is what a lot of people have gotten their snouts into. And it has deeply, deeply degraded science and the scientific discussion about climate change in the United States. I was involved with it before for a long time, but I watched it in 2018, 2019, and I watched a systematic effort to take down things like Extinction Rebellion, to undermine and circulate this garbage through people who went out against COVID-19. So the fundamental conspiracy was this. Only people who said that COVID-19 the vaccine is dangerous, the lockdowns are wrong, 9/11 was a inside job. These people, only if they said that 9/11 was that climate change was a myth, were they promoted. And I'll close by talking about David Ray Griffin. Now, David Ray Griffin, a very brave and thoughtful intellectual, was a leading figure in the effort to investigate 9/11, starting already in 2001. And his book, A New Pearl Harbor in 2004, was a historic achievement. I have read his works and been inspired, and he was front and center in the effort to demand justice for state crimes. He wrote a book in 2015 called Unprecedented: Can Civilization Survive the CO2 Crisis?, based on his research, in which he exposes clearly a conspiracy to try and deny the impact of carbon and other emissions on the climate and the catastrophic impact it will have on the biodiversity and on the future of humanity. This book, by a card-carrying member of the truth-telling community, has been totally ignored by these groups pushing that they are opposed to state crimes, but saying that climate change is a myth. And they have refused to admit that one of their own has, in a scientific, effective manner, presented a very powerful argument for why humanity is facing an unprecedented crisis because of carbon emissions and other emissions and the resulting global warming. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuel. So, this has been pretty wide-ranging. You've jumped right in, Emanuel, and taken decisive positions on forest fires, on that humans do contribute to what's going on ecologically. Dane Wigington says that there's been so much ecological damage to the atmospheric layer that now more UV light is entering. And when I feel the sunlight on my skin, I feel a heat factor that I don't recall noticing when I was younger.
Mhm.
And maybe it's making up in my mind. I read on a Dane Wigington post in one of his Facebook, and somebody who was a citizen monitor for UV radiation. The federal government had a program to distribute UV radiation mechanisms across the country and invited these citizen scientists to point it in the air or at the sun, take recordings and make records. And so one of the things I posted in the newsletter was a link to a adaptation theory, which has been represented in a PDF as an academic discourse. So the powerful people that run society I have often heard the remark that, well, if people knew the truth, they would go crazy and they can't handle it. So we have to keep things secret from them. Now, John Spritzler makes a simple observation that, people already they know the jig is up. They know that plutocracy is running a wicked game and that it's appropriate to get rid of them and make a society that's intentional around how we use technology, intentional around how we make our food, intentional around the toxins we put into the atmosphere and how we manage these things. We're transparent, open, and honest about this. This is something that could be. Right now, we're living in a muddle of lies about, human impact on ecological structures of the planet. That's absolutely a taboo topic.
Right.
And I think that's what's been muddled and covered up in all of this. Let's go straight to John Spritzler. And you've been listening. You have perspectives. I haven't studied your chat posts. They have a lot of graphs indicating maybe that you're looking at information that covers hundreds of thousands of years, and that there's a relativity for warming and cooling and so on and so forth. But I'll say this as I pass the baton, the talking stick, to John Spritzler. Even if there are these natural cycles, and even if more sunlight enters, and even if this is all going to happen regardless of human activity, humankind is still left in a kind of pickle, in the pickle of natural circumstance, where some places are becoming hotter, less habitable. Some places are, the water is changing and altering, and coral reefs are just drying up. So there is this predicament that we're all left with, no matter whether we agree with the scientific argument or not. That's what I will say. But let's go to John Spritzler. What's your reflection on this? I call it teeth gnashing, but what are your thoughts? And then we're going to open it up and reflect from others, and start really kind of, seeing if there is any kind of consensus in this call.
Mm-hmm.
John, do you want to share, or do you want us to, do you have a thought?
Here's my thought. First of all, contrary to what one person on this Zoom call has written, people who do not think that human-caused CO2 is causing catastrophic global warming are not enemy infiltrators. And I feel of two minds about even participating on this call, because the person on this Zoom call has asserted that of people like me. And I've written about
just
that.
To be, John Spritzler, that passage was removed from the essay, but it's been duly noted that it was an inappropriate tone and position to take relative to creating a liberation coalition where we can talk
Okay,
together
well,
and advance
I'm
policy.
I'm glad it was removed because it was
Yes.
extremely offensive.
Okay.
Okay, now about CO2. I have seen zero scientific evidence based on presenting data that makes a persuasive case that human-caused CO2 is causing catastrophic global warming. No one on the Zoom call has presented that data or even pointed to a URL of a scientific article that does so. It, as far as I can tell, it does not exist. There are zillions of affirmations, but as Emanuel himself pointed out, that counts for nothing. So I put a link in the chat just recently that includes URLs that have things I posted on the chat earlier before some people might have come on and hence can't see them. But with a number of plots of data of CO2 and global temperature as estimated as best people can with methods that are used over not hundreds of thousands of years, but many millions of years. And, you know, the story is that we're in a particularly low temperature phase in a slightly rising period of a low temperature phase. CO2 levels are lower now than they have almost always been by huge margins. If you look back at over millions of years, that when CO2 was much higher than it is now, life flourished on this planet exuberantly. The dinosaurs, the Mesozoic and so forth. So I am going to repeat that no one has shown persuasive evidence that human-caused CO2 from burning fossil fuels is causing catastrophic global warming. Now, the second point I want to make is that people keep using the phrase climate change as if the issue were a debate about whether or not there is climate change. That's a diversion. It's a debater's trick. The climate has been changing on this planet for billions of years. Nobody denies that. We are in a period of climate change because at every time in the history of this planet, it has been a period of climate change with cycles within cycles within cycles, as is pretty well established. And none of this indicates that we are in a period of catastrophic global warming. There's just no indication of that, quite the contrary. But, you know, you want to show me the data of trends of CO2 and temperature over millions of years and show where we are and show me how this is persuasive that we're in a period of catastrophic global warming now and so forth. Well, fine, go ahead and do it, but no one has. Now, the third point I want to make is that there's a class war on this planet. The yellow vests that Emanuel mentioned, which in France, who led a wonderful working class movement in France in 2018 that was sparked by the government raising the price of diesel fuel for the cars that they working class people in France needed to commute to work. And they rose up, and they were right to rise up. And they're rising up again right now, as I posted on my current Substack, today's Substack. And they are being oppressed by the government's raising of the price of diesel fuel. Now, on the other hand, fighting in the exact opposite direction is Extinction Rebellion, claiming that because of CO2 causing catastrophic global warming, that it's correct for the government to raise the price of fossil fuels to lower its consumption to save the planet. So on the one hand, you have the yellow vests fighting a wonderful, just cause for the working class against the rich of this world. And then you have Extinction Rebellion saying that the yellow vests are the enemies of humankind because they're fighting against what has to be done to save the planet. Well, I say we take the side of the working class, not only because the working class is fighting against oppression, which of course is a very good reason, but also because the working class is not wrong in fighting against this oppression. The working class is not causing the destruction of the planet and of the human race by doing it, and Extinction Rebellion is false in asserting that. So there, I'll stop.
Hey, John, just the yellow vests are asserting that the working class are doing something bad. Is that what you just said?
No, you didn't hear me at all. The yellow vests are the working class in France who rose up in 2018 and again currently against the ruling class of France over many issues, but the one that was the main one in 2018 and still an issue is against the ruling classes raising the price of fossil fuel, in particular diesel fuel that they need for their cars to commute to work. The working class is against, and the yellow vests are the biggest working class rising up in France. They're against the ruling classes raising the price of fossil fuels. And Extinction Rebellion is saying that it's a necessary good thing to raise the price of fossil fuels to try to end the use of fossil fuels in order to save the planet from catastrophic global warming, which will destroy humankind. So,
Okay, so that's another divide and conquer example, isn't it? Of one group pitted against another group's values.
Mhm.
yeah, you can.
Okay, I mean, let's keep you're closing your remarks with an observation of class war. You're observing how the class war is conducted by having a group called Extinction Rebellion that fights for what they think is right.
Yeah, let me just make it clear. I'm not saying that Extinction Rebellion is wrong because they're going against the working class. That would be illogical. I'm saying they're wrong. There is no scientific evidence that is persuasive to support what they say. And therefore, it's a pretty bad thing when people use a wrong idea to attack a wonderful working class movement.
Okay, good point. So let's go to Emanuel and then Mark to respond, and let's keep our remarks just within a reasonable time frame. I'm just going to summarize what I heard John Spritzler say is that the climate change is a meaningless term because it's always happened. I would agree with that. It's a meaningless term because it's always happened, and
It is a meaningless term.
and it was in fact
It was forced on us.
yes, to replace global warming. Global warming is not a meaningless term, and I invite John Spritzler to reflect if he even thinks that's happening, or if, and I'll anticipate that, John, what you would say is that yes, global warming may or may not be happening, but to the extent that it is happening, it's a natural phenomena of galactic age.
We're in in terms of the long period of the planet, we're in a very cold phase relative to the long millions of years of the planet. In that
How do you explain the ice melt?
in that cold phase, it's a cold phase because there's ice. There are many periods in the planet's history when there was not ice. We are in what is called an ice age because there is ice.
Goodness.
There isn't
Okay.
always ice,
Okay.
but we are in an ice age. But we are in the warming period of that ice age. Now, when you zoom in, in the last 20, 30 years, and look at those data, there was this embarrassing recent 20-year period when everybody had to admit, by everybody, I mean all the scientists who write for Nature, the journal Nature and such, when they all had to admit that we were in what they called a warming hiatus, meaning there was no evidence of warming for those 20 years, contrary to the predictions of all their models, which said there would be alarming warming during those 20 years. They all had to admit, they called it a hiatus because they couldn't say there was no warming, so they had to say it was a hiatus, a temporary pause. And then they all had to come up with excuses for why this hiatus was happening. And they all had like 50 different excuses for it, which is a sign of bad science. When you cling to a hypothesis, even though the data doesn't support it.
Chuck, I want you to step in here at this point and let us respond.
Okay, that's fair. So let's go for the responses. The second point you said is that CO2, more of it proves nothing, was the essential point. So let's go to Emanuel and then Mark, and then we can loop back, and John, you can defend yourself later.
Right. Right. Well, at this point, I mean, I feel like pulling out of this conversation. John Spritzler is talking like a paid agent. He's acting like a paid agent, and he's flooding us with garbage. I'd love him to address real scientific research. And if he did, it would be immediately obvious what's happening in the world. The fact that there are periods in which the temperature goes down or up is a natural process. But the trend over the last 100 years is clear, and it's increasing dramatically. The reason people say climate change instead of global warming, which is a mistake, is that just like on the Titanic, the fact that the ship is sinking doesn't mean that there aren't parts that are going up, right? That's what happens when ships goes down. So there are areas closer to the poles which get colder as the poles melt. But the catastrophic effect is clear. And I'll stake my reputation now as someone who's been willing to risk everything in the pursuit of truth and policy, whether it's on 9/11, on COVID, or a whole slew of other things, that I've worked on this for 30 years, and I haven't seen any conviction. I've read now 30 of these articles on climate change denial, and they're full of crap. And then none of them take on what you'd have to do if you want to do scientific research, which would be to take on the fundamental research on climate change and show how it's wrong. And this has not been done. So I am disappointed, and I'm somewhat disgusted by John's attempt to try and flood us with garbage in the way which sounds to me like a paid agent. And I did not write that. Mark did, but this is my impression of your behavior, and I feel that Green Liberty has to engage clearly in counterintelligence because we're being infiltrated by paid agents who are being paid to discredit us, and this destroys our credibility in the Green Party because comments like what John just flooded us with are exactly the reason that we don't have the influence that we ought to have in the Green Party and in the United States. And I feel disgust at that sort of betrayal by an intellectual of his moral duty to uphold the scientific method.
So, Emanuel, you are fiery, and you've just alleged that John Spritzler.
It's obvious. It's obvious. I've been reading his garbage, and I am disgusted by it. And it's combined with his fake egalitarian arguments to say that we should be egalitarian, but we should do nothing. I've not seen him organize a single thing. He's just in his own room, flooding us with all these ideas and doing nothing. And this is what paid agents do. They distract us with words, and they do nothing. And I am disgusted with his activities. He has undermined Green Liberty. He has undermined the Green Party, and he has undermined the efforts of serious intellectuals in America to deal with climate change, with the drive for war, and with the increasing power of the plutocracy through his fraudulent, fake egalitarianism and his denial of climate change, which is the overwhelming threat to humanity today.
So, Emanuel, I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to say that I remain in solidarity with the egalitarian possibility and with John Spritzler, and that what we're witnessing, I don't think John Spritzler is an infiltrator paid. Maybe he is, that would be an interesting kind of thing to explore further. But I consider him a friend, and that he's been immersed in the same media world that, well, that we are all immersed in, and he's coming up with data points. Now,
well, wait a minute. I've got some data points that he's ignoring.
okay, so I'm not gonna.
Let me respond here.
Okay, that's fine. We can have you respond, and John.
Okay,
can, But okay, so
John
go
Splitzer's
ahead.
basically.
But you know what I need to ask you to do, Mark?
I'm not going to call anybody a paid infiltrator. I want to point to the fact that in my article, very early on, I say that carbon is the highest level that it's been in 800,000 years, and I give a link to that. I just put that in the chat. It's an EPA link. It shows that the rise in carbon went, until recent times, went from about 175 parts per million up to 300. And what my understanding is, whenever it reached 300, that's when you had periods of warming. Right now, at least in recorded history, 2024 was the warmest year in recorded history. In fact, you can go back the past decade and you can see it was the warmest decade in recorded history. Anyway, it went up to above 300 parts per million, just above it in 1950. And now it's at 430 parts per million. So to say that carbon has nothing to do with it is nonsense. And to say that it's a small increase when carbon has never represented more than, it's always been small in the atmosphere. It's never been 1% of the gases in the atmosphere. It's never been 1/10 of 1%. It's been 4/100ths of 1%. At one time, it was less than, 3/100ths of 1%. So looking at it scientifically, it's gone up significantly. And to just ignore all the science that's going on, ignore all these scientists and say, oh, they're somehow, they're paid to do this, and they're spinning conspiracy theories, is just bogus. I mean, I think the evidence, and I did provide a lot of links in this article and to various information, and I think that shows it. That if you look at the graph, going back 800,000 years, it was never at 400 parts per million, and it was, then to say it was much warmer, maybe it was millions of years ago when the Earth was forming, but in the past 800,000 years, this is pretty remarkable that we're now, at 430 parts per million, and it's going to go up. It's not going to, the idea of COP is to keep that the rise of global average temperature from going up more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7
So, Mark,
degrees
let me ask you a question.
Fahrenheit. Yeah.
Okay, let's just kind of remove from the table of conversation whether CO2 is an issue or not. Now,
what would be the point of that?
Because the CO2 is the decisive issue. If according to John Spritzler's information, we could have tons and tons and tons more of CO2 in the environment. That's what the whole claim of a hoax is hinging on: is CO2 scientifically impactful or not? Or if it is impactful, in what way? Now, this whole idea of warming, does it really warm? Is it really doing the warming? This is what's happened: is we've entered the weeds, and we're making this argument that either you accept CO2 or you don't accept it. And that's the divide. I think and where I'm at as a green libertarian on this matter is it doesn't matter anymore. It's irrelevant. The bottom line is that humans need to, well, the bottom line is what's the true scientific impact of humans on the planet? And you
Right.
can't just look at CO2. You got to look at
Right.
everything
Mhm.
across the spectrum.
Right.
So you burn a gallon of gasoline and some CO2 comes out. Nitrous oxide comes out. Some other effluents comes out. A whole bunch of stuff comes out. So what's the consequence of all of that? This is what's missed in climate change. So climate change covers up global warming. Global warming, okay, let's say it's scientifically so. It's just from nature. Nature is warming up the planet. Well, then humans need to know, okay, if the planet is warming up, then what do we need to do to adjust our own lifestyles, our own existence in order to live in certain areas, grow food in certain areas, survive, generally speaking.
Well, wait a minute.
So,
Okay. What greenhouse gases are doing is they're slowing the heat loss. They're basically the upper atmosphere is cooler, is cooling the upper atmosphere, but it's allowing for warming at the surface and lower parts of the atmosphere. And that's because greenhouse gases are slowing heat loss from the lower atmosphere. So it's being trapped. And that's what greenhouse gases are doing, is they're trapping the heat. And so the more greenhouse gases.
so let me ask John Spritzler a question. John Spritzler, do you accept the theory in global warming that the Earth atmosphere is a closed system, relatively speaking, and that if three volcanoes go off at once, that there will be an impact atmospherically and climate-wise?
Yeah, the volcanoes can have an effect.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I'm not claiming to be any kind of an expert on that, but
I'm not suggesting you are an expert on that. I'm just using logic. And I mean, I know that within some of these camps, there's a kind of denial of the physiology of the planetary ecosystem. And, in some camps, there's the prospect that humans could grow to 25 billion people, and we could, with technology, accommodate them, and we would do fine. This is, now Emanuel cited the limits to growth, which was a Rockefeller-produced text, but Emanuel represents that, well, there's some truth around that there are limits to the earth. And this is kind of at the bottom here of what's at conflict, is how we look and how we think of ourselves as human beings. And as a radical green, I argue we need to be thinking ecologically. And that means we need to preserve nature. We need to expand biodiversity. We need to resist the loss of biodiversity. Right now, the people who argue that there is no climate change issue, that we can we can engage in unbridled burning of fossil fuels, no problemo. We could burn more coal, no problemo. Let's just fill up the atmosphere with more carbon. It's all for the good because plants like CO2. This is the reasoning. Now, but I also understand a closed system, a balloon, and that if you fill the balloon with smoky substance, the substance inside the balloon will be smoky. That's a fact. It does, and this is all of this impact of human industrial society is lost in the debate about global warming and so on, I think. And it just skirts where the debate should appropriately be. And that is, how do we as humans function as ecological stewards and not treat the planet like a friggin' machine like technologists do and the technocrats who have no seemingly heart for nature. So let's wrap up our our debate here. I mean,
Can I say
yeah,
one more
go
thing?
ahead, Mark. And where are you?
What I want to say was that, you know, years ago, and this is actually came up yesterday, I watched a YouTube video about this mountain in Peru that is dramatically changed, conditions. It used to have a lot more snow and ice on it. And Arlene Bloom, who was a chemist and got a lot of very dangerous chemicals banned, was also a mountaineer. And she gave a slideshow in 2015, and it was 2005. This is like 20 years ago. And she shows pictures of all kinds of mountains that had a lot of snow and ice on them. That she shows, like, when they had snow and ice on them, and then years later, decade later, no snow and ice. You know, Kilimanjaro in Africa is one of them that doesn't really have hardly any ice left on it. So we're seeing that. We're seeing a ice going away, glaciers like disappearing, snowfields disappearing. That's fairly common. That's not unusual. And when you look at this, there's this video. It's actually pretty fascinating. Probably nobody here is a rock climber or a mountaineer, but there's a Shanka in Peru, and it's a combination of rock and snow and ice, and a lot of the ice is melting, whereas all of a sudden you've got a lot of loose kind of rock underneath that was held together by the ice. And it's you can look at pictures of when it was first climbed and then what it's like, and even these guys that tried it several times, what they're claiming, how it's changed. So we're actually seeing, and I can tell you my own personal experience, what I've seen in the past year. Maybe it's just a drought year, and that's very possible, but I think we've seen it in our own lifetimes, that there's 116 degrees in Portland in 2021. It's not supposed to get to be 116 in the Northwest. That's like Phoenix temperatures. So anyway, that's I'll leave it at that.
Okay, let's go to John Olsen.
Okay, yeah, been listening here. I noticed that Emanuel has left us after his intemperate rant. I'm really I mean, what to say after accusing John of being a paid agent. I'm just as well off without him if he's going to act like that. But yeah, I think, the key questions, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, is we do have an ecological crisis. The temperature is rising, and it's affecting, but it's not only temperature. When we say climate change, there's all these pollutants that are being added by humanity's interventions, chemicals that were not part of nature, plastics. I could make a litany of all these, which I don't have to do here. But we got an ecological crisis, and I think the idea, I will repeat, I think CO2 is the Lee Harvey Oswald of this discussion. It's being blamed for everything when it might play a minor role in some, not that Oswald did, he was trying to save Kennedy, but the point is that CO2 is playing the same scapegoat role. And conceivably, it may have a minor role. I think methane is more of a danger, and I think geoengineering is the giant, the poison, the literal, deliberate ruling class poisoning of the ecological balance of nature, poisoning because they want less of us. They think that we're too many because we threaten their rule, and they know it. And I think we need to come from that perspective. And so that gets back to John's point of we need to find a way to eliminate their power over us. It doesn't mean going out and shooting them, of course. That's not what we mean by eliminating the rich or abolishing the rich. So I hope sober voices will prevail here, and most of you have been. And Suzanne makes an interesting point. During the 9/11 time, there was a few days when all the airplanes were grounded and things kind of ground to a halt. And very quickly, animals began to come back to places they had abandoned. And even at the nuclear response in the nuclear, I'm trying to think of the name, in Russia, actually it was Ukraine then. the big nuclear effort
Chernobyl?
that happened. Was
Chernobyl?
it? Yeah,
Chernobyl?
Chernobyl. Yeah. Even there, animals have come back and seem to be thriving because the human activity has ceased. So when given a chance, another one was after Krakatoa. It wasn't long before the area kind of rejuvenated. So nature is extremely resilient if we give it a chance. And so, and Bernadine is saying, how do we divide and conquer billionaires? Well, my point has been, we do like the Soviet Union did and allow secession by regions, biological, bioregions. I think we need to have some discussion on that. So thank you for that question, Bernadine. Texas can be its own country, which is where you live, I know, and so forth. So
Oregon does not want to unite with Gavin Newsom. Nope.
I couldn't hear you.
I said Oregon does not want to join with Gavin Newsom.
Oh yeah. Oh right. So you could have the Pacific Northwest without, or maybe Northern California, which would break off from the Newsom section, or maybe he can just be sent out to pasture and put in maybe an asylum somewhere where he'd be harmless.
So we're going on an hour and a half, and our meeting has been focused on discussing global warming, climate change, human caused or not, CO2. Emanuel got very fiery with John Spritzler. John, do you want to say for the record if you're an infiltrator or not?
They pay me so little, it's really disgusting. We need a revolution to get a higher pay for infiltrators.
I'm sorry that Emanuel felt he had to say that, but he feels very strongly, if I'll speak for him, about this topic, and he's taught a college course on it. He's read materials, and he thinks that it's an important topic to be honest about, and somehow he's picking on you, John Spritzler, for representing the climate denialist perspective. But
I think he's upset because basically I put some data on the chat and I said, show me the data that backs your argument, and he got angry at that.
Well, and I think that's where I'm coming at from this is when you go into the data points, you can argue ad nauseum. Just like with the COVID thing, it's amazing to watch the Robert Kennedy HHS secretary speaking to senators and about the Center for Disease Control, CDC. And you, John Spritzler, have a background as a researcher at PhD level with vaccine, I understand, and I assume you kind of trust the science, and yet we have people speaking absolutely past one another on this matter of the safety of the COVID mRNA tech. We don't have to unpack this. I don't want anybody to respond to that, but I feel that that's what's happening on the global discussion of climate change, human impact, how we should live in an ecosystem, in an ecological world. That's not a machine. It's not a disease thing that can be corrected with technology, whether it's spraying into the atmosphere to reflect light back and so on. We are in a crisis of society being run by technocrats, mad scientists, and I'll just close with this. 30% of the reported academic papers are fraud. I mean, that's I'm not making this up. So what's true is what we're grappling with. And I go agnostic on the details when in my heart I feel as a radical green that we need to be defending the earth, going post-capitalist into a world that lives according to egalitarian principles, ecological principles, and for the good of all. And that's where I stand in green liberty. So let's get a closing remark from anyone, and we're going to end our recording,
All right.
and we can hang out and chat. I don't think we necessarily resolved this. Have we? Do you feel like there's been some kind of dialectical development, John Olsen? I mean,
I think what we can agree is that we have an ecological crisis.
yes.
Is that, and that the fact that the climate is warming is contributing to climate change, which has some negative consequences, but there are many factors involved. Is there anybody here on the call that would disagree with that?
Probably not.
The issue that humans face is whether to adapt to changes that we cannot stop, or to do things wrongly thinking that we're going to stop the changes, but that don't actually stop the changes. And I think that people saying that if we stop burning fossil fuels, we'll stop the changes, have no evidence to back that up. And the rational thing to do is to, as best we can, to adapt to the changes, some of which are unpleasant, and you know, we wish they were not happening. But
Well, one thing, John, is what we can do is to eliminate the toxicity. I mean, by doing what you're recommending, we get rid of the ruling class that is lording it over us and doing all these terrible things. We can then start detoxifying ourselves and the planet and the soil and the water and the air, and don't do these ecologically destructive things.
That's right. And you know, to do the rational things requires having the power to do the rational things.
Exactly.
We don't have the power to do a lot of the rational things, but at least we should be thinking in terms of, you know, let's be trying to do the rational things, and that means adapt to changes on the planet that are happening as they have happened for literally billions, with a B as in baby, billions of years.
And that was the topic that I posted, adaptation theory. I think that this should be available in our in the academy. That link is in the newsletter. And let's give the final word, and we're going to end a recording, to Mark Rolofson. And again, this has been a Green Liberty Caucus National Meetup. And we've been grappling with climate change, global warming, human caused or not, and how to think about and how to prove these propositions for demanding change. Mark Rolofson, what is your thought?
Well, my thought is we cannot ignore the problem entirely. And I think,
what is the problem? Say the problem, and then
the problem is the fact that if is a loss of biodiversity from the planet warming. And that is going to be catastrophic to the oceans to begin with, that people rely on. You know, the oceans are, when the oceans die, we will die, because the oceans provide all kinds of, you know, life for the planet. They you know, absorb carbon. They're part of the carbon sink. But the loss of biodiversity, you know, they're saying, you know, something like, you know, 30% or more of all species, both animal and plant species, will be gone by the 2050. And by the end of the century, probably as much as 70%. That's going to be hard on human society, to the point where, you know, it's going to be it's not going to be the same. And you know, who's going to survive? I don't think that's a world that we're going to want to live in. I mean, there might be a few billionaires that can move to the cooler regions and somehow grow food out of greenhouses. But you know, we're talking about something that probably can be solved. And I'm not convinced that the green energy, the renewable energy systems are the best energy systems. I think that they are, on one hand, renewable energy actually has surpassed this year energy production for power plants over fossil fuels. And there's a lot of wind farms, and there's a lot of solar farms now. So we might as well use those things because they already exist. But free energy is one thing we didn't talk about. And that's a whole nother thing, that if we had free energy, we could get rid of all this stuff.
Then let's, okay, then we're going to close. We actually interviewed, I don't remember his name. He's posted on our YouTube, an individual who spoke about free energy. And there's a thing called black shelving. Black shelving is when the powerful corporation purchases a patent on a device that would reduce the use of fuels and create free energy and so on. And that's a whole nother conversation. And talk about keeping secrets from the people is the black shelved technology. And if we liberated from the plutocratic power structure that operates through continuity of government actors and conducts deep state operations and suppress our democracy, why we would have arguably have access to the state and access these black shelved technologies and open them into society. This is a whole nother conversation, but bottom line, we the people need to form mass movement to create democratic destiny, because right now we're tending toward a technocratic fate that does not honor human dignity, ecological dignity. It's a bunch of mad fucking scientists running society. Sorry to use the F word, but I use French for dramatic purposes when it works. Any other closing thoughts? And we're going to end our recording. This has been Green Liberty National Meetup. I'm happy that you've all shown up. It's been a small group, but we're committed to engagement in society. End of our recording.